At present, the most famous plane crash in Pennsylvania is undoubtedly Flight 93, which went down on September 11, 2001. It was the only plane that did not make it to its intended target. Flight 93 crashed a short jaunt from the Lincoln Highway in Somerset County, and you're probably already familiar with its story and how the passengers rebelled against the hijackers, losing their lives but sparing others in the process. There was another air disaster, almost 7 years prior. This particular catastrophe would be one of the worst in American aviation history. It would be the first crash site to be declared a biohazard site. It would be one of the longest investigations as well, and it crashed roughly 10 miles from the Pittsburgh International Airport on a hillside between a shopping center and Raccoon Creek, immediately outside of Aliquippa in Beaver County. Before I get into this story, I should note that this is still a fresh event in the lives of some local people, and I know at least one person who listens periodically who has been personally affected by the crash, so I shouldn't have to say it, but just to be clear, this is not a retelling of the event in an attempt to fetishize the tragedy, especially one which, at the point, was rife with controversy. Not only regarding the crash, but also in the aloof and discourteous manner in which the airline handled the situation with the victims' families. So, just the facts. U.S. Air Flight 427 left Chicago's O'Hare at 5 in the evening on Thursday, September 8, 1994. Keep in mind that Chicago is in Central Time Zone and it was 6 in the evening in Pennsylvania when the plane took off. The flight was scheduled to land about an hour and 15 minutes later at Pittsburgh International Airport, and from where it would travel to West Palm Beach, Florida for the evening. On board were 127 passengers as well as 5 crew members. Most of the passengers on board for the Chicago to Pittsburgh flight were from western Pennsylvania or northern West Virginia. However, there were people from as far off as Montreal, Quebec, and even a Reauthologist from Del Mar, California, who was en route to deliver a lecture at Pitt. Flight 427 was a Boeing 737, a really common aircraft. I believe it's the most common aircraft, and they're still in use today, with nearly 9,000 having been constructed between 1967 and 2015. Flight 427 was constructed in the late 1980s, so it was a relatively new plane when it was up in the air last. At the time of the crash, the Boeing 737, designed as a smaller version of the 707, was the most common commercial plane in the skies. The pilots on the plane were both experienced and capable, good reputations. There was the captain, Peter Germano, who had been with U.S. Air since the early 1980s. Chuck Emmett was only slightly less seasoned. The flight was reported to be without a vent. The weather was good, late in the summer. The temperature was in the mid-70s as the captain came over the intercom to instruct passengers that they would be arriving in Pittsburgh within a few minutes and to prepare for landing. Flight 427 was just under 6,000 feet in the air at 7:02 in the evening. The tower at Pittsburgh International Airport instructed the crew to change route and to keep an eye for a smaller flight which had just recently departed and was a few miles off. The plane was preparing to turn east from their southeastern course, immediately south of the town of Aliquippa, and from there they would loop over the junction of Interstates 79 and 279 in the Wexford area, at which point the plane would then start turning for a straight western direction which would bring it to the Pittsburgh International Airport for landing. The other plane, which had departed Pittsburgh International Airport, was about 4 miles in front of them. It was spotted by the co-pilot Emmett, who begins to say as much when, 5 seconds before 7:03 in the evening, they hit wake turbulence. What is wake turbulence? Imagine a plane is a boat in the water leaving a wake, the waves in its path, rather. A Apparently, the physics of planes traveling through the air is much the same, and anyone who has traveled the friendly skies knows that turbulence is not entirely uncommon. The turbulence experienced at this moment in the flight was not what was responsible for the disaster that occurred. It was 7:02 p.m., 7:02 and 55 seconds p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Flight 427 would be in the air for only 28.13 more seconds. Just before 7:03 p.m., Flight 427 hits wake turbulence from a departing plane. The turbulence knocks the plane to the left. The cockpit recorder records a sound, a loud thud, and 7 seconds later the plane's autopilot is taken off, and the captain and co-pilot try to resolve the situation manually. 5 seconds after the autopilot is disengaged, the plane begins to enter a stall. The altitude alarm begins to go off, and the cockpit recorder picks up the violent vibration of the plane's controls. 8 seconds later, at 7:03.15, the captain radios the emergency. The plane is dropping nose first, corkscrewing in the air. The pilots can be heard struggling with the controls. The co-pilot keeps shouting, "Oh shit." At Pittsburgh International, the instruments at the control tower can't read the plane's altitude as it's just descending too fast. Had you been in the parking lot of the Giant Eagle in the Aliquippa area on September 8th, just after 7 in the evening, you would have been able to watch a plane fall right out of the sky. There was a youth soccer league over in Hopewell Township on a pitch in which the plane traveled immediately over before crashing into the ground at nearly 300 miles an hour. Kids on the soccer field quoted in the newspapers, and they were able to feel the ground shake immediately following the impact. It was 7:03:23 seconds, a mere 28 seconds after the turbulence. The plane had impacted with such force that a Beaver County sheriff was quoted in the Baltimore Sun a couple days after the accident as saying, "You go up there," quote, "you go up there and look for an airplane, and you won't find one." Numerous fire departments were dispatched to the scene as soon as calls began coming in. They came as far away as Ohio. Due to the crash being visible to anyone outside in Aliquippa or large parts of Hopewell Township, the emergency switchboard was a flurry of incoming calls. The following morning, responders began combing the site for victims. It was not the same sunny day that Thursday had been, and the sky held a light rain. The first responders had attempted to save anyone they could, but as one of the responders was quoted as saying, there was just nobody there to save. The carnage was such that the recovery team was treated against hepatitis. The investigators declared the site a biohazard site early on and donned protective clothing as such a necessary precaution. This would be the first time a plane crash would have such a distinction. Maybe you've forgotten in the 20 plus years since the disaster, but this is going on at the same time as the O.J. Simpson trial. Now, the reason why I bring that up is DNA usage in criminal cases and in identification was not as prevalent as we take it to be today. In fact, you may call a stand-up skit by Dana Carvey that occurred around this time, and he had a joke while impersonating a member of O.J. Simpson's defense team, asking what is DNA, and then stating, just 3 little letters, it probably stands for did not attack. The coroners, therefore, had to identify the victims primarily through dental records or other skeletal things that they would wear, such as hip replacements or metal plates or rods in like your hands or in your back. So it was a long process. And there was some confusion, because while there was confusion among the coroners, so too was there with families. Apparently, there hadn't been the best of records of who was on the flight. Several people on the flight were initially scheduled to arrive in Pittsburgh on a later flight. Some family members were told by the airline that their loved ones were not on the flight at all, only to be informed hours later that they had been. Other people tried to contact the airline for information but did not get much in return. Those who were waiting at the gate at the airport, and you need to keep in mind that this was before 9/11 when you could do that, the people waiting at the gate reported that they were pulled into a room and told by airline staff that there had been a crash and that there were fatalities. They weren't told much else. Even high-ranking members of the investigation team stated that they felt the human situation had been handled poorly. The airline did fly the family members out to Pittsburgh, and counselors from Pittsburgh's various hospitals were at the airport to volunteer their services. One family member was quoted in the New York Times on September 10, 1994, as saying that most of them, those who had lost family, would not be able to move forward until they knew what had caused the crash. They would have to wait nearly 5 full years before the National Transportation Safety Board was able to conclusively determine exactly what caused the plane to go down in the dramatic and seemingly unprovoked way in which it did. In the interim, there would be numerous theories. One of the more colorful stories involved a bomb. Apparently, a passenger on the plane was a drug informant, high level enough that someone, it was believed, would be willing to plant a bomb on the plane. No evidence of this could be found, though. Another theory received some attention in the news was that the right engine of the airplane had accidentally been thrown into reverse, which the proponents claimed would account for the wobble in the plane before it began its rapid twisting descent. Some people even believe that the pilot may have intentionally crashed the plane. Weeks into the investigation, though, investigators were of the opinion that the answer lay in the rudders located at the tail of the aircraft. It would be some time before they would be able to prove this theory, though experimentation involving extreme temperature shifts, recreating the cold of high altitude, and the sudden injection of the hot fluid that operates the rudder system. Before the mystery was solved, though, President Clinton signed the Federal Aviation Reauthorization Act in October of 1996. Part of this legislation was aimed to create an advocacy support system for the families of victims. So poorly was the handling on account of the airlines, it was felt that more needed to be done to ensure that families were recognized and that they were having their questions answered. The Federal Aviation Reauthorization Act was created as a direct response to Flight 427. In March of 1999, the National Transportation Safety Board closed its investigation, citing problems with the 737's rudder system as the cause of the accident. Boeing, who had been in communication with the investigative team, were aware of the 1996 thermoshock test that had demonstrated how the rudder system of the 737 could fail, and spent nearly $1 billion redesigning and installing the improved rudder system on new and existing 737s. The National Transportation Safety Board's investigation into the crash was inhibited by the fact that there were no survivors who could attest to what had occurred or what they witnessed, and the cockpit recorder did not really capture much contextual information from the pilots. According to the lead investigator, neither the pilot, Germano, nor the co-pilot, Emmett, had any idea of what was going on or why the rudder system was responding in opposition to the pilot's command. Pilot error did not play a factor in the disaster. I remember driving past the site of the crash within a month of it occurring. I couldn't see anything from where I was, but I remember my aunt, who lived in Aliquippa, speaking about it briefly, and about being able to see the smoke from her house nearby. For whatever reason, I have a distinct memory of driving in the car with her that day as we went past and she pointed it out. and I was staring out the passenger window of the front and admiring how green all the leaves were. They were just about to start turning for autumn. If you go to the crash site today, there is a monument dedicated to those who perished in the crash of Flight 427, a flight number which has since been retired. I'm told that occasionally, but with decreasing frequency, someone walking around the crash site will come across a small fragment of metal from the plane, embedded in the ground or just neglected in the woods even after these years, and they'll place that bit of metal, that bit of wreckage, on top of the memorial. As always, if you have any comments, questions, photos to share, feel free to email us at drpennsylvania@gmail.com.